Alright class, my name is Professor Carl Stinator. Welcome to Not Giving a F 101. Imagine, you have a game you are very passionate about and want to make a video about it, say Resident Evil 4, but you have not showered yet. What do you do in this situation? Timmy?
Well, Professor, I think this is a trick question because getting dressed and taking a shower won't take much time at all. So you should just do it and be more professional in your video.
What? No. 5 points from Gryffindor for that egregious answer.
But we're not even at Hogwarts.
Get out of my class! Alright. Crackhead in pink?
What? Oh, no, I don't know, just record a video in your pajamas. Nobody gives a shit.
Yeah, that's a surprisingly great answer. What metrics would you use to judge what is the greatest game of all time? In my Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time video, I have mentioned a few candidates to that title, but I haven't delved deep into what criteria do people even use when discussing those games. See, one of the most important criteria that people talk about is the influence that the game had on the gaming landscape as a whole. And another one, which is equally important in my opinion, is simply how fun the game is in the current moment. And well, there are of course other criteria, like an interesting story or emotional impact, and while I do not think that Resident Evil 4 will be winning in the latter two categories, if we're judging by the impact it had on the gaming industry and how bloody fun it is to play even right now in 2023, this game has a very strong claim to being the greatest of all time. And well, is it? That's what we're gonna discuss in this video. When RE4 first came out all the way back in 2005, it was a polarizing game. On the one hand, you had all of the critics and the journalists and the reviewers, and frankly, most of the gamers playing this game saying that it's a fantastic title and one of the best games ever made. And many people would tell you that this is the best game they have ever played. On the other hand though, you had a very vocal minority of Resident Evil fans who were incredibly angry at the direction the fourth installment has taken the series in. Those people grew up playing the classic survival horror Resident Evil titles and were understandably miffed when the newest one was an action game instead. And of course, now over 18 years have passed since the game first came out, so the game is old enough to drink in pretty much any civilized country. And those opinions have quieted down a little bit, and even a lot of people who were overt haters in the early days have grudgingly come to respect the game for what it is. A fantastic action adventure. But I got to say, it is completely understandable that those fans were pissed back in the day, because yeah, I have played Resident Evil 1 recently, and Resident Evil 4 is not only a completely different game, it is a game in a completely different genre. And it makes sense that it is like this, because the game's creator, Shinji Mikami, did not want to make another Resident Evil game. See, Mikami is a bit of an eccentric genius, and he does not believe that games should be getting sequels. In his opinion, the maximum number of installments in any game series should be 2. So after he created the original Resident Evil and helped consult on Resident Evil 2 and 3, he was out on the series. He wanted to move on to brand new projects. But the Capcom management was like, no man, the sales are going down. We really love the money that Resident Evil is giving us. You will make a new Resident Evil game. And Mikami was like, alright, I will, but on the condition that you let me make something entirely new with just loose ties to the Resident Evil universe. And well, Capcom had to agree. So what happened is Mikami basically got his wish of making an entirely new game, and Capcom got to call it Resident Evil. So to play the devil's advocate here, it is completely understandable that Resident Evil fans were miffed, as if not for corporate executives, this game would not even be called Resident Evil. So I can completely understand that if you approach this game wanting to get more of something you already love and got a completely different title instead, you might be disappointed. That said, this is the only way you'd ever be disappointed about Resident Evil 4, because this game is simply fucking fantastic, and let's talk about it. Now, to give you my perspective here, I am a brand new Resident Evil fan. I have only completed Resident Evil 1 for the first time 2 months ago, and since then I fell in love with the series. I have played a lot of Resident Evil 2 and 2 Remake, although I have not completed those games yet, so keep that in mind. And the second Resident Evil that I decided to complete was the most revolutionary one. The 4th installment, the one we're talking about right now. Do you really have short-term memory loss? And just to keep my bias out of the way, I approach this game as a modern gamer, right? I am a Gen Z. I was born in 1998. I was 7 years old when this game came out. So yes, I am used to modern game design, and I will judge this game by modern game design's lens. That's what I do on this channel, because people were really confused under my Super Mario RPG review. That's what I do. I am a kid who wasn't even born when most of the games I cover on this channel were created, but I still enjoy playing them, and that's how I want to cover them. I want to sell them to my generation, to people who never had the opportunity to play those games in the first place. And yes, I am now a Resident Evil fan, but I have ignored the series for many, many years, and in part, it was due to me playing a really, really horrible PC port of this game, Resident Evil 4, back when I was like in 4th grade, because yeah, when the game first released on PC, it did not even have mouse support. You had to use the arrow keys on your keyboard to aim your gun while moving with WASD. It was a horrible, horrible experience. I think I lasted like 40 minutes playing it, and ever since then, I had the opinion that Resident Evil is just this really clunky Japanese game series that I don't have any interest in playing. And I haven't changed my mind until now, when I finished the first game. So I am coming into this video with a really fresh set of eyes. So just keep that in mind. I have no nostalgia for this game. In fact, the only memory I ever had of Resident Evil is hating this very installment of the series when I was younger. Alright? So do not call me a fanboy for loving the game. Alright? Fantastic. Now, before we finally start reviewing the game, there is one matter we have to settle. The ports and the remake. So, first of all, this game has been released on absolutely everything. You can play it on your PS2, PS3, PS4, PS5. You can play it on your Switch, you can play it on the GameCube, you can play it on the Wii, you can play it on the Xbox 360, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, probably the Wii U, although nobody had that, so nobody cares. And of course, you can play it on the PC, and that's how I completed this game, although I have also played the GameCube original version. But what's even more interesting is that this game just received a remake in 2023, and this remake is available on the PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, and of course PC. Now, I have dabbled with the remake, and it is a fantastic game, but in this video we will not be covering the remake. I will make a separate video about it down the line, but I will also explain later on in this video why the original is still worth playing, even despite being remade. Alright, fantastic. So, just to recap, I have completed the PC version, and that's where most of the footage you'll be seeing in this video is coming from. But I have also played the GameCube version, and I will give a detailed rundown of all the ports of this game later on in the video. Alright, fantastic. Alright, but let's talk about the actual game, starting as I usually do with the story setup. So, you play as Leon S. Kennedy, the same protagonist as in Resident Evil 2, who between the events of the two games enrolled in the Secret Service and became a sort of personal bodyguard to the American president. And the game begins with Leon arriving in some kind of a village in rural Spain in order to investigate the disappearance of the president's daughter while on vacation in said country. And immediately you'll be able to tell that something here is not quite right. As soon as you go up to the first villager to ask him if he knows anything about the president's daughter's whereabouts, he immediately turns to attack you with blind fury in his eyes. And when you arrive at the actual village itself, all of the villagers do the same. They attack you with not a word of explanation for why they don't want you there. And I think that the game's main enemies and how they came into existence illustrate the tonal shift between the earlier Resident Evil games and this one perfectly. See, in RE1, 2 and 3, your main enemies were simple zombies, slow, mindless creatures created as a result of biopharmaceutical corporations' illegal experiments. Whereas in RE4, your main enemies are the Ganados. The Ganados are basically just normal people under the control of a parasite called Las Plagas. The Ganados are allowed to maintain their personalities, they talk like humans, they act like humans, they move like humans, but yet they share some kind of a hive mind connection between all of them and Lord Sadler, the game's main antagonist, a cult leader who has hatched a conspiracy to basically gain control of the entire world. And this really shows you the kind of movies that inspired the game. See, Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 were inspired by low-budget horror movies, whereas Resident Evil 4 aims to transport the experience of being in a big-budget, high-octane Hollywood action movie with horror elements to your game's screen. And I got to say, in both cases, Shinji Mikami succeeded perfectly. While Resident Evil 1 was a fantastic example of a B-movie horror translated into video game, Evil 4 really does feel like you're watching a really high budget, high production, early 2000s action movie. And I have to admit, for as different of a tone as Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 4 were going for, I think that both games deliver perfectly on using their gameplay systems to create the kind of tension that you would want in the movie they're emulating. Let me give you an example. Resident Evil 1 is a quintessential survival horror game, using fixed camera angles and the scarcity of ammo to create an atmosphere full of tension. Use the tension to create dread and anxiety of never knowing what's around the corner and will you even be equipped to handle it. Meanwhile, Resident Evil 4 creates a much different kind of tension, the one that you would want in a high-octane action movie. The game is no longer a survival horror game, no matter what anyone says. It is now a third-person shooter, but it still manages to use gameplay mechanics to produce tension perfectly. The camera is very close behind Leon's back. You can't see what's behind you, and you will still have a scarcity of ammo, But whereas in the earlier games, that scarcity was really dangerous, and if you used your guns willy-nilly and tried to kill every enemy, you would simply run out of bullets and be unable to complete the game. Whereas in Resident Evil 4, it always feels like you're about to run out of bullets, but I've never once done that throughout my entire playthrough. Instead of creating dread and anxiety, the tension that Resident Evil 4 creates serves to pump you full of adrenaline and make sure that you never feel comfortable staying in one place, that you feel like you always need to move, that you always need to shoot, that you always need to explore every nook and cranny to find that extra piece of ammunition that might make the difference between your survival and death. And one very important part of the gameplay when it comes to increasing the tension are the controls. Surprisingly, while the first, second and third game were known for their clunky and stiff tank controls, where you would have to press up on the D-pad to move the character and press the left or right to rotate them, and you would have to stop and aim your gun to actually use it, Resident Evil 4 actually does exactly the same thing, which would seem weird in an action game, but I'm happy to say it is executed perfectly. The movement here is surprisingly smooth and easy to use, but what I really love is the fact that you have to stop and aim your gun. And I got to say, while this works great on the gamepad, which the game was designed for, it is even better with a keyboard and mouse, because it really does feel realistic and natural, but at the same time, the fact that you are incentivized to always keep moving in this game, but you have to stop to aim your gun, creates yet another bit of tension that adds to the adrenaline that the game keeps pumping into your veins. Adore Shinji Mikami and what he was able to accomplish in both games. While there will be some nitpicks that I have towards Resident Evil 4, just as there were some nitpicks that I had towards Resident Evil 1, this man has such an insane mind for creating gameplay systems that create exactly the kind of emotions that he wants you to feel. I am blown away by how this man managed to create two games which are part of the same series, which emulate different movie types, while also being completely different video games, and yet both masterfully using their gameplay to create exactly the kind of tension that the story needs. It is simply immaculate what this man was able to achieve with the story and gameplay of RE4. And equally incredible are the audio and visuals here. The sound effects are so crisp and so perfect. Gunshots really feel both satisfying and weighty, and the music playing in the game, while never something that stood out to me and I noticed besides a couple of scenes where it was really important, it creates the kind of atmosphere that every scene of the game is going for perfectly. And my favorite piece of music in the game has to be the one that plays while you're saving it. Because when you get to a point where you can save the game, it is supposed to be an opportunity for you to relax, to let go of all of the tension that was built up in your body by the frantic gameplay, and get ready for an even stronger dose of that that's about to come. So the music that plays while you're saving the game on a typewriter is this eerie yet soothing piece that reminds me of the feeling of finding a bonfire in a Dark Souls game. if you've ever experienced that, you'll feel so at home in Resident Evil 4 whenever you're saving the game. I absolutely adore this musical piece. And I've got to say, the visuals here are incredible. Now, the team behind Resident Evil was always known for using every kind of trick in the book to squeeze as much of graphical performance as they could of any console that the game was on. Whether it's Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 using pre-rendered backgrounds to add so much more detail to the game that the PS1 would normally be able to render, or Resident Evil 1 Remake using the exact same technique to create a GameCube game that still looks beautiful by modern standards, or in the case of Resident Evil 4, where they decided to go for a 16:9 cinematic movie aspect ratio, despite most of the TVs and consoles at the time only ever using the 4:3 squarish aspect ratio, which not only gave the game a more cinematic feel and accidentally ensured that it is really easy to display and scale onto modern monitors, it also allowed the creators to increase the level of complexity on the screen, as they didn't have to render out the top and bottom portions of the image, which is once again a brilliant piece of almost hackery that was done to create a game that's simply immaculate graphically for GameCube standards. Now, of course, as a result of that, the original GameCube release renders in 640 by 360, which is not a high resolution at all, but is really easy to scale it up to for modern monitors. And thanks to the great models and textures created for the game, running it on modern hardware is simply fantastic. I played it on PC, where I was able to increase the resolution to 1440p, and while of course the game cannot compare to modern titles like, I don't know, its own remake, it is still incredibly impressive graphically and does not look at all like a 2005 game. The art style here is simply great. Although I do have one single minor nitpick, which I understand it was done to maintain the game's atmosphere, but unfortunately the game's color palette really doesn't work for a game set in Spain. I'm sorry, but I was in many parts of Spain in many different seasons, and even on the worst day of autumn, it is really hard to find a Spanish village so gloomy and overcast as Resident Evil 4 paints them out to be. Now, sure, the architecture here is on point for a rural Spanish village, but yeah, the colors make it look way more as if it was set in, I don't know, Germany, Poland or Romania, or some kind of a northern European country. So just a minor nitpick, but as I am a very proud European, I have to complain about inconsistencies like that. And yeah, that's about the only nitpick I can have when it comes to the graphics. Okay, so we went over the basics of what makes this game great, but now let me dive into some of my favorite parts that really elevate it to perfection. And the first of those is of course the gameplay. I've already mentioned that the control scheme works perfectly here, no matter if you're playing with a gamepad or with a keyboard and mouse combo. But what I did not talk about yet is how damn satisfying the gunplay feels. Now, first of all, to kill a normal enemy with your basic pistol that you start the game with, you will need to empty nearly an entire magazine into it, just as you would in Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3. But an important addition that completely alters the flow of gameplay here is the fact that you can now headshot an enemy, which will almost certainly stagger them, allowing you to run up to them, kick them down, and strike them with a knife in relative safety. Now, of course, this is a risky maneuver, because if the enemy is surrounded by allies, you might open yourself up to attacks, But then again, it allows you to conserve a lot of ammo, because if you're skilled and fast enough, while it would normally take you an entire magazine to kill just a single Ganador, using this tactic, you might be able to dispatch of him using just a single bullet, which is fantastic, and it once again adds a lot of tension to the gameplay, especially early on in the game. And you are not limited to just the pistol. There is a ton more guns that you'll be able to find later on in the game. First of all, even in the starting village, you can find the shotgun. And the shotgun, as you would think, does way more damage than the basic pistol, able to hurt multiple enemies at the same time. But as you would figure, the ammo is incredibly limited and is much less accurate at longer ranges than the pistol is. Then you'll be able to find the rifle, and the rifle, as you would expect of course, is your long range, really hard hitting weapon that allows you to deal a ton of damage, but is also incredibly slow, and you will not be able to use it when surrounded by a crowd of Ganadors. There is the TMP, which I've almost never used, that is able to stagger and dispose of enemies rather quickly, but burns through ammo at an alarming pace. Later on you can also get a revolver, and the revolver is a very, very hard hitting weapon that is only balanced by an incredible scarcity of ammo, so you will only want to use your magnum against the strongest enemies and bosses. There's also the rocket launcher, which you can find one just playing the game, but it is just a single use weapon. You can only shoot it once. You can of course buy other rocket launchers later on in the game, but you have to of course plan out their use strategically, because they cost a lot of money and they only offer you a single shot. But as a balancing act, they are able to insta-kill most of the bosses if you hit them with a rocket launcher during a vulnerable phase. There is also the grenades and the knife, which I already mentioned. There is a ton of variety when it comes to the gunplay, and I haven't even mentioned the fact that there is different kinds of guns, different kinds of shotguns, different kinds of rifles. There is just a ton of different weapons in the game that you will be that makes it so that you will be able to customize your playstyle to perfection. For most of the game, I would use the gun to dispatch most basic enemies, along with the kick and knife combo. I would use the shotgun when surrounded by a crowd, and I would use the rifle to take out strong enemies from afar. And this worked fantastically for me, but you know, a different player might figure out, why would I even carry the shotgun? The TMP can fulfill that role for me. And that's fantastic. I absolutely love how much customization you have here, including the fact that you can upgrade those guns, and each of those guns can be upgraded to increase the damage, the firing speed, the reload speed, the ammo capacity, and each of them also has an exclusive upgrade that boosts one of those stats much farther than you can go normally. But, well, those upgrades cost money, which introduces another one of the gameplay mechanics here that are fantastic, which is treasure hunting. At the beginning of every chapter, you will be able to buy a map from the merchant that shows where the treasure is. Of course, you don't have to do that. You don't have to invest the gold into the map if you think you can find the treasures yourself, but the map is a nice help. And the treasure system here is, again, really fantastic. You will find a lot of like precious stones or brass watches that you'll simply be able to sell to the merchant for a high price by themselves. But you'll also find a lot of gems and things like crowns, masks that clearly have holes in them where gems can be placed. And by saving those, not immediately selling them, and combining them together, you will be able to get even more money from the merchant, which creates this constant gameplay loop of searching for treasure to sell it to the merchant to buy back upgrades for your guns, which the gameplay loop is simply fantastic. It is extremely addictive, and it really does make you excited for when you're finally going to get the next gun upgrade. But one important thing I noticed here, which might help you on your playthrough, is that whenever you buy an ammo capacity upgrade for a gun, it gets filled up to full. So this creates this kind of minigame that you can play with yourself later on in the game. When using the shotgun or the rifle, or especially the magnum, you'll want to save it so that there's at best 0 or very few bullets in the chamber before you upgrade the weapon, so that you can gain maximum value, because you cannot purchase ammo from the merchant otherwise. The only ammo we get is whatever you find in the world and whatever you get while upgrading weapons. So I remember very fondly of one sequence when I was running very low on rifle bullets, and I remember trying so hard to use just the 5 bullets that I already have loaded up and still survive long enough so that I can make my trip back to the merchant and upgrade the rifle to get like 23 bullets. It was exhilarating, and it is a fantastic system, even though if I don't know if it was intended. But while the gunplay and treasure hunting are wildly known to be fantastic, one gameplay system that was criticized often is the companion you get, namely Ashley, the president's daughter. I've read a lot of opinions about how Ashley is very annoying, how she gets in your way, how she constantly whines, how she's very easy to get kidnapped by enemies and you have to rescue her. And honestly, I have not experienced that annoyance on my playthrough. I found that Ashley was a fantastic sidekick who, yes, you have to care for her because she is not experienced in combat, she's not gonna help you fight the enemies, and you will have to catch her when she makes tall jumps because she's just scared to go down a ladder. But this is fun to me. This is just a very fun way to have a character that you have to protect. But in my experience, Ashley never really got in my way or was annoying to handle. At worst, I remember one area where there were just a lot of enemies and I have to take them out using grenades. I just told Ashley to wait for me before I entered that area, cleared it out, and then called her to join me. So I really do not understand the complaints about Ashley. I think that her addition into the game is fantastic, especially the one section later on in the game where you play as her, which was genuinely scary, which I cannot say about most of the game. And since we've already mentioned Ashley and how she contributes to the gameplay, let's talk a little bit about how she contributes to another part of the game, which, once again, as I mentioned, is one of the strongest parts here, but also one of the weakest ones: the pacing. When it comes to the pacing, the first 10 or so hours of this game are simply perfect. I can't stress this enough. The first 10 or so hours of this game have the perfect amount of repetition and variety spaced out in perfect amounts to make the game feel constantly fresh and ensure that you never get tired of it, even for a second. During the village stage, the game is purely action oriented with nearly no puzzle or horror elements, but it still manages to be fresh by constantly introducing new mechanics, as well as giving you and taking away from you the companionship of Ashley. And I think that this is why I never was for a second bothered by her presence, and that's because of how different the game is while you have Ashley with you and while you do not have Ashley with you, both in terms of the gameplay itself as well as the tone. Having Ashley with you adds some much needed levity to the situation, makes you feel like you're gaining progress throughout the adventure. But Ashley, at certain strategic moments, the game will just take Ashley away from you. And usually that's by placing her in some kind of mortal danger that you have to once again rescue her from. But then, during the next few hours, playing the game without Ashley feels kinda lonely, and you are extremely happy to be reunited with her later, only for her to be taken away again just as you might be getting tired of her. This is perfect, and the same applies to the locations, at least earlier on in the game. See, the village is varied, but once again, it is purely action focused. So around 6-7 hours into the game, I was growing a bit tired of it. And just at the perfect moment where I was like, okay, this game is getting a little bit long in the tooth, you visit the castle, which is a completely different game. Now, still, you're playing with all of the same mechanics, all of the same controls, all of the same characters, but the castle has way more of that classic Resident Evil vibe. You're suddenly thrust into this rich, opulent place where the enemies just don't feel like they belong, and suddenly you have way more horror elements. Now, the game is still not scary, but there are some genuinely heart-pumping moments thanks to that. And the puzzles finally make a return. Now, once again, they are not in any way difficult, especially compared to some of the later game puzzles in RE1, but they are a very nice change of pace. And I was surprised because I was like, yeah, this game is nice, but it doesn't feel like Resident Evil at all. But then I got to the castle and my love for the game was completely reinvigorated by how much it started reminding me of classic RE. And that's fantastic. I wish the game kept that going on throughout the rest of the game, because I would say after about the 12-hour mark, the pacing kinda drops off. I really feel like the castle overstays its welcome by like a couple of hours, and the island which you visit after going to the castle should have probably been split into 2 different locations. In the latter parts of the castle and on the island itself, you might get a little bit of a tonal whiplash, because the game will be throwing you into some actually scary stages which do give you that sense of anxiety that earlier Resident Evil games would, and immediately after throwing you into the scariest stage of the game so far, it will throw you into the most actiony stage of the game so far, where you are not scared at all, but you're just fighting hordes of enemies after horde of enemies, only to again ramp up the scariness to the highest level yet, only to again ramp up the action to the highest level yet. And those switches between scary and pure action movie are really grating later on in the game. Not to the point where it will like ruin my experience, but there is a noticeable difference compared to the perfect pacing of the first 12 hours or so, which really made the game drag a little bit towards the end. And I do feel like it would be better if either it was like 3 or 4 hours shorter, or if they just decided to lean into the horror elements and make the sewers and the lab a separate area which is focused purely on scaring you, and then gave you the island as a complete action gaming release of all the tension that they built up throughout the sewers and the lab. But instead you get interspersed through the sewers, then the castle again, then the island action stage, then the lab, which is very scary, and then again an action stage on the island. That just felt weird to me. If I would hazard a guess, I would say that they probably didn't want to create a long scary stage, because it could serve as a barrier for players to actually finish the game if they're not used to horror. And I understand that, and I appreciate that if it in fact was the motivation, but I really wish they would just lean into the horror more, so that the action sequence at the end would be a cathartic release instead of just whatever. But you know what's funny? That this is the worst thing I can say about the game. The pacing at the end kinda drops off. This is like about the only flaw I can realistically find. But there is another one which I would want to talk about later on in the game. There are a few stages which force you to solve puzzles while under threat by a constant wave of enemies, which again most people enjoy, but I just don't like personally, because I am shit at multitasking, so what ended up happening in those situations for me is I would frantically scramble to use as little ammo as possible while killing all of the enemies, not knowing if they're truly endless or will end at some point, and only after I finally cleared out them all or was running low on ammo did I decide to go like, okay, now it's time to solve the puzzle, because I just can't multitask. But again, I think this is just a me problem, not a problem with the game, so, but still think this is worth mentioning. And one other stage that I don't think people talk about as being like notoriously frustrating, so once again, it might just be me, was the minecart ride. Oh my god, I was so annoyed. I had to repeat this level like 5 separate times because I just kept dying there. I don't know, just felt kind of frustrating to me, especially since there's some QTEs at the end, which I haven't talked about yet, which are pretty easy to fail. And yeah, let me mention the QTEs here. This game is often criticized for overusing those. And if you don't know what a QTE is, it's basically where during a cutscene you get a button prompt that you have to rapidly press or mash the button to progress further into the cutscene, because if you don't do it fast enough, you will fail and die during a cutscene. Some people will criticize the game for that and be annoyed that you want to put down a controller during a cutscene and just, you know, take a drink or whatever. And while I get that, I love the QTEs in this game, man. I think that they allow for some ridiculous action movie scenes that would be frankly impossible during the game itself, and allow the game to really lean into that action movie aesthetic. I did not mind the QEs here at all, really. I found them to be quite perfectly executed, as most of the game seems to be. But you know what isn't perfectly executed here? I don't, because the story certainly is. Now, the story here is not anything thought-provoking or very emotionally engaging, but it is still good enough for what it is supposed to be. A fun story in an action game that will keep you engaged and going towards the end of the game. And this here is accomplished perfectly, because even during some of the most frustrating stages of the game, like the minecart chase, I was still kept going by the story because I wanted to see it, because I wanted to see Leon's mission to the end. You get the very simple premise of trying to save the president's daughter, interspersed with the whole thing about the cult and the mind control parasites and the cult's leader, Lord Sadler, whose cronies you will successfully and successively be eliminating throughout the game. This all just flows together so well that even if the gameplay was lacking, which for the record it is not, it would still be motivating enough to see me through the end of the game. And that's in the large part thanks to the characters here. You've got Leon, who's your typical early 2000s action hero who delivers constant one-liners and is incredibly charismatic.
Not to worry. We've prepared a special ritual for you.
I love Leon. He's a fantastic protagonist here. He's someone that, while not maybe super relatable or super fleshed out, is just fun to pilot and, you know, really fun for a young man to adore, which is what the entire purpose of action heroes was in the first place. For what he is, Leon is perfectly executed and he's balanced fairly well by the supporting cast. You've got, of course, Ashley, who's I think like 14 in this game. She's a teenager who's incredibly scared, thrust into situations she's not capable of handling.
Leon!
Ashley! You
did good.
I'm sorry if I was...
Oh, don't worry about it. Come on, let's move on.
She's not a tough person because she wasn't ever raised to be one, but she does grow and mature throughout the runtime of the game, being really scared at the start to becoming much more cold and determined towards the end.
How are you feeling?
Like $1,000,000.
I thought you were gonna die. Alright, guess I'm up.
Which I like, Ashley. She's a great character, but the greatest character in this game is one who sadly doesn't get enough screen time. Luis Serra, the guy you meet early on in the game.
Small world, eh? Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude! And I don't believe there's any relevance with my figure and my standing. Who are you?
Oh, excuse me, Your Highness. Perhaps the young lady might want to introduce herself first before asking someone his name.
He's a scientist, and as you find out later, I'm trying to keep this mostly spoiler-free, so this isn't a big reveal or anything. He's the guy who actually worked on Las Plagas and is kind of the reason for why Sadler has access to the parasite. He feels guilty about that. He wants to fix his mistakes, but most importantly, he just wants to get the fuck out of that place. So he starts working with not only Leon to accomplish his goals, but also the returning character of Ada Wong, international super spy and Leon's crush. And in the words of Leon Kennedy himself, when it comes to pussy, if it's not Wong, it is wrong. He doesn't actually say that anywhere, but he totally would. He totally would. Now, Ada is a fantastic character. She has her own motivations, and you do feel like she has a bit of a soft spot for Leon, and because she does save him on multiple occasions where she doesn't really need to, because he's not necessary for her mission to succeed. But on the other hand, she's not beyond holding him at gunpoint to get what she wants.
Sorry, Leon. Hand it over.
Ada, you do know what this is.
So they do have a really interesting dynamic going on there. And I have to say, for everything I said about Leon not being relatable, his taste for women who would hold him at gunpoint to get what they want, yeah, I can relate to that. So we're reaching the end of the video, but before I mention all of the game's ports and talk about the remake question, let me tell you that this game has some incredible set pieces and moments that will stay with you like for a long time. First of all, you've got the village siege sequence, you've got the entrance to the castle and how opulent it suddenly is after the greyish poverty of the village. You've got the fight in the sewers of the castle, which I'm not going to spoil because you want to witness that for yourself. You've got the death of one of my favorite characters in the game, which was incredibly sad and really made you want to get the revenge for them. There is the sequence in the lab when you encounter the regenerators, a new kind of monsters that has 3, 4 or 5 weak spots inside them that you can't see, and if you don't hit all of those weak spots, they will just infinitely regenerate and chase you. And the only way to actually kill them is to find the thermal scope for your rifle and target all of those weak spots, which this is a fantastic sequence in the game. It's not a long sequence, but it's absolutely heart pumping. The minecart sequence, for all of the bad I can say about it, is still infinitely memorable. There is the bulldozer scene, which I don't think I even recorded, because there was just too many cool scenes in the game. And there is the final assault on Sadler's base, where you are supported by a helicopter. And once again, if the game really leaned into the horror aesthetic of the lab a little bit more, this would have been like the most legendary catharsis moment in all of gaming. And there's just so many of those set pieces the game is really perfectly directed, and it does leave you with the impression that you just play through your own Hollywood movie. That is truly Resident Evil 4's main strength. And well, another strength is the fact that you can play it fucking anywhere now. The game was literally ported to everything. So let's talk about the ports, as I like to do on the show. There is only one port that you need to avoid, which is if you find a physical release of the game for the PC, run, because it might be the original one that I played all the way back in 2008, which is poorly optimized, doesn't even feature mouse support, and is just downright horrible. That is one version of the game that you would avoid. But besides that one, there really isn't a wrong version of the game that you could play. You could argue that the PS2 version has lower quality graphics and audio, but yeah, even despite that, the PS2 port is still a good way to play the game, and if you have it, or if you want to emulate it, I will not stop you. It is still a fantastic version of the game, and you will still enjoy your time with it, as you will with some of the ports that are better, but just, you know, kind of obscured by the time, which I would call the PS3 and Xbox 360 ports. Those are very fine ways to play the game, but just not what I would recommend right now. What I actually would recommend, the best way to play the game right now, is either to emulate the GameCube original, or to play it on the PS4, Xbox One, Switch, PS5, Xbox Series, one of those, like one of the newer releases. They just have upgraded graphics compared to the original. They run at 60 FPS, which, yes, it might cause some issues with the QTEs, but it's really not that big of a deal. And the GameCube original is just the original experience, and still a fantastic game that holds up really well to this day. And there's also the two ports which I consider interesting, so they are in a tier of their own. First of all, there's the Wii port, which adds motion controls, and I have not been able to play the game that way myself, and I would also not recommend that for the first playthrough to anyone. But goddamn, does it look fun, and I definitely want to experience RE4 on the Wii, because it really does look like a incredible way to play the game. And the last one, also going in the interesting category, although it could as well go into the ideal category, is the current PC port. You can get it on Steam and it's really cheap. I got it for, I think, like $4 on sale, and the reason why I think it's an interesting way to play the game, right? You can play at pretty much any resolution. It runs at smooth 60 FPS. I played it in 1440p, so the game looked gorgeous. And you can have the original experience of playing with the controller if you plug one in, but you can also decide to play it with the mouse and keyboard, which, yeah, I know, it's not the intended way to play the game, and just like the motion controls version on the Wii, it does take away a bit of the difficulty, but I just don't give a fuck. I still think it's a fantastic way to play the game, and that's how I decided to play through the game, because it was just incredibly fun playing it with mouse aiming. Simple as. But, of course, there is the elephant in the room, the one version of the game you might think it's more worth playing than any of those I've mentioned so far. So let's talk about the remake. See, when it comes to the remakes, my philosophy is this. They are on a spectrum, right? On one side, you've got remakes that are incredibly faithful to the original, and they just update the graphics, add some quality of life improvements and maybe some additional content, but they don't really change any of the original content, and as such you will not be missing out on anything if you play just the remake. And examples of that include the Super Mario RPG remake as well as Metroid Prime Remaster. Those are pretty much the definitive version of those games. In those cases you can make a great argument that there is no reason to play the original anymore. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got games which change so much about the original to the point of becoming an entirely different game. See, for example, Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is in a completely different genre than the original and takes a lot of liberties when it comes to the story, Or Metroid Zero Mission, which is a remake of the original Metroid game, which adds so much content and changes the pacing of the game so much that the story is really the only thing that remains the same about both of them. When it comes to Resident Evil, it doesn't help the matters that Capcom has made some remakes that are definitely way far to that side of the spectrum. Like Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake are just completely different games than the original. And in those cases, if anyone tells you that the original is obsolete and you don't need to play it because the new games are so much better, well, that person is a lying cunt, and don't listen to them, because those are completely different games. RE2 and RE2 Remake, completely different games. Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake, completely different games. And all of them are worth playing. Where Resident Evil 4's remake sits on the spectrum is much closer to the middle, but still on the new game side. It is actually similar to the remake of Resident Evil 1, which wasn't released that long after the game originally came out, and took all of its ideas and polished them and modernized them and brought them in a new age. And similarly with RE4, it doesn't change the genre of the game, like RE2 and RE3 Remake do, so you could argue that it can replace the original. And while that argument certainly can be made without me calling you a lying cunt, I still do think that there is a case for playing both the original Resident Evil and the original Resident Evil 4, despite the remakes being pretty much the same game but better. And in this case, it is the unique controls of RE4. See, RE4 Remake is fantastic, I've played it and it is an incredible game, but it does change a lot. It changes the controls, you no longer have any semblance of tank controls, and I really do think that those are one of RE4's main selling points, because they are what makes it different from all of the other third-person shooters on the market that were inspired by this game but dropped the control scheme. And it also changes the story, which, once again, I haven't finished RE4 Remake, so maybe the new story is simply better told, but I don't think it is. It really changes the character progression of some characters here, and some of the voice acting in the new game, like Ada, is simply inferior to the original. So while, yes, at the end of the day, you could skip RE4 and just play the remake, I do think that you would be missing out. And, well, that brings us to the conclusion, because I definitely feel like you would be missing out if you decide not to play RE4 at all. I think this is one of those games that simply every gamer should experience at least once in their life, and is truly one of the best games ever made. Now, is it the best game ever made in my opinion? I don't know. I don't know if I can call it the greatest game ever made. I still think that Mass Effect 2 might edge it out over the top, but for now, I am comparing a game that I just finished for the first time in my life to a game I have played as a 13-year-old, and of course I replayed it since, but not in the last 5 years. So just by the fact that I am comparing a memory, which might be a bit idealized in my head, to a game which I actually just finished and actually just discussed all of its flaws at length, and it's still close. Yeah, well, to no one's surprise, as I mentioned at the end of my Super Mario RPG video, while that game was the lowest rating I've ever given, and I have already given a 10 out of 10, Resident Evil 4, receiving the same score, is still the highest rated game on the show so far, because it's the first to receive the greatest of all time medal from me. It is a fantastic game and a complete must play. If you lasted all the way through watching this video, you owe it to yourself to just go and either grab the GameCube version of the game and just emulate it, or buy it on one of the consoles, or just buy it on Steam like I did and play through it, you will not be disappointed. This is one of the best experiences in gaming, and it has aged wonderfully, because even though there are a ton of imitators of this game on the market and a ton of games try to do exactly the same thing, there are still some things which were considered flaws at the time, like the controls, which other games did not decide to copy, which just make RE4 even more of a one-of-a-kind game and truly, truly a masterpiece. So with all that said, see you soon, do all of the YouTube things. I will be reviewing RE2 and its remake very soon, so stay tuned for that. And next time, we'll be jumping into a series I've already mentioned a couple of times on this episode, with Metroid Zero Mission. So, see you soon.